I've always been surrounded with music. It's something that gives me joy. It's something I want to do for the rest of my life. Living a balanced life and take them with me into the future.
There's a certain kind of story the internet loves to tell itself. A beloved young performer seems to step back from the spotlight, and almost overnight, comment sections fill with the same question. Where did she go? Is she okay? Did something happen? For years, Karolina Protsenko was one of those performers, a violin prodigy whose bow seemed to carry sunlight down 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica, drawing crowds of strangers who would stop mid-errand just to watch a child play like she'd lived 100 lives. Millions of people grew up watching her videos. And then, in the middle of last year, something did change. Not a disappearance, not a tragedy, something quieter and in its own way more interesting. A teenager decided she was ready to stop being introduced as the violin girl and start being heard as herself. This is the story of how Karolina Protsenko became Karolina Rose, and why the real answer to what happened to her is less a mystery and more a coming of age. Karolina was born on October 3, 2008, in Kiev, Ukraine, into a household where music wasn't a hobby. It was the family's native language. Her father played guitar. Her mother played piano and sang. Long before Karolina could hold a violin properly, she was absorbing rhythm and melody simply by existing in that home, the way other children absorb a second language from parents who speak it at the dinner table. In 2015, when she was 6 years old, the family relocated to the United States, settling in Simi Valley, California. It was around this time that Karolina picked up the violin for the first time, guided by a local teacher. And something in her took to it immediately, not just technical aptitude, but an emotional fluency with the instrument that usually takes performers decades to develop, if they ever develop it at all. For 2 years, that talent stayed mostly private, refined in lessons and living room practice sessions. Then in the summer of 2017, when Karolina was 9, her parents brought her violin to Santa Monica's 3rd Street Promenade, and everything shifted. She began performing pop songs on the open pavement, unpolished and unplanned, just a small girl next to an open violin case. But there was nothing small about how she played. Passers-by stopped. Crowds gathered. People filmed her on their phones, half in disbelief that a child so young could make an instrument sound like it was telling a story. Her parents, initially cautious about putting her in front of strangers so publicly, watched the joy she brought to people's faces and understood they were witnessing something rare, not just a skilled young musician, but a natural performer who lit up the moment she had an audience. What began as weekend busking quickly became something much larger. Karolina's family started uploading videos of her street performances, and the internet did what it does with genuine, unforced talent. It spread. Her early covers, blending classical technique with pop sensibility, found an audience far beyond Santa Monica. She began collaborating with other musicians, including a much-loved duet series with her mother, Ella, whose voice paired with Karolina's violin in a way that felt intimate even through a screen. One of her viral breakthroughs was a rendition of Despacito, which introduced her to international audiences and helped push her subscriber count into the millions. As her platform grew, so did the scale of her collaborations. She performed alongside Italian saxophonist Daniele Vitali, developing a sound that blended 2 instruments not often paired together in pop covers. She reworked hits like Dance Monkey and Another Love in her own style, each cover feeling less like an imitation and more like a reinterpretation, the kind of thing that made people who already knew the original song hear it differently. By her early teens, Karolina had built a multi-platform following spanning YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, with tens of millions of combined followers and billions of cumulative video views. Her cover catalog eventually grew to include hundreds of songs spanning genres: pop, rock, Latin music, film scores, classical repertoire, each one filtered through her particular way of making a violin sound like it was having a conversation with the listener. Karolina's rise wasn't confined to algorithmic virality. In 2019, she was invited to perform on The Ellen DeGeneres Show, where she played a violin cover of Post Malone's Sunflower in front of a live studio audience. Ellen, visibly moved by both her skill and her composure, surprised her on air with a custom-made blue violin and a personalized tip jar for her busking sessions, a small but symbolic gesture that acknowledged where Karolina's musical life had actually started, on a public sidewalk, not a stage. She later appeared on The Kelly Clarkson Show as well, further cementing her presence in mainstream entertainment rather than just internet culture. Her collaborations continued to grow in ambition. She performed with America's Got Talent finalist Angelica Hale, pairing violin against Hale's powerhouse vocals in a rendition of Clean Bandit Symphony. As she moved into her teenage years, Karolina also began stepping into more formal classical settings, performing with Orchestra Nova LA and later debuting with the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, playing movements from Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor, repertoire that required a level of technical and interpretive maturity far beyond what most 15-year-olds are asked to deliver. She also took part in a masterclass with violinist Jennifer Coe at the Colburn School in Los Angeles, one of the more prestigious classical training environments in the country, signaling that her ambitions weren't limited to viral pop covers. She was actively building the technical foundation of a serious classical musician alongside her internet career. While her instrument brought her fame, Karolina's influence increasingly extended beyond music itself. She became something of a role model for young people learning an instrument, with countless fans crediting her videos as the reason they picked up a violin for the first time, including stories from as far away as Vietnam and Brazil. In 2022, she launched Play with Karolina, an online cover contest that invited fans to submit their own violin performances. Hundreds of young musicians from dozens of countries participated, and Karolina personally reviewed submissions and offered feedback, turning a marketing-adjacent contest into something that felt more like mentorship. She also used platforms like TikTok to share more candid, unfiltered moments, including posts acknowledging difficult days and performances she felt hadn't gone well, which resonated with fans precisely because they broke from the usual highlight reel format of internet fame. By the time she reached her mid-teens, Karolina Protsenko wasn't just a musician with a large following. She had become one of the more recognizable young classical crossover performers in the world, someone whose career trajectory seemed to point toward an eventual and inevitable next step, making music that was entirely her own. This is where the actual story, as opposed to the invented mystery, begins. Karolina didn't vanish. She evolved. In July 2025, she announced a new, artistic identity, Karolina Rose. It wasn't a rebrand driven by controversy or crisis. It was the natural next step for a performer who had spent nearly a decade interpreting other people's songs and was ready to write and release her own. Under the name Karolina Rose, she began positioning herself as an independent singer-songwriter, someone who plays violin, piano, and guitar, and who sings her own material rather than exclusively performing instrumental covers of other artists' hits. Her first singles under this new identity, including Good Girl and Make You Stay, were released across major streaming platforms in 2026, marking her formal transition from cover artist to original recording artist. For longtime fans who had followed her since she was a 9-year-old busker, the shift required some recalibration. The algorithm-friendly violin covers that had built her audience were no longer the centerpiece of her output. But for Karolina, the change represented artistic maturity rather than disappearance. A young musician who had spent her entire adolescence performing other people's songs finally stepping into the role of the person whose songs get performed. This is, in many ways, a familiar pattern among young musicians who build their first audience through cover content. Interpreting other artists' work is an extraordinary way to develop technical skill and stage presence, but it is inherently limited as a long-term artistic identity. Eventually, performers who are serious about a lasting career look to create something that belongs to them alone. Karolina's transition to original music, under a name that is distinctly her own rather than a shortened version of her surname, reflects exactly that kind of deliberate, considered pivot. It is the difference between being known for what you can play and being known for what you can say. Inevitably, any shift in a public figure's presentation invites speculation, especially online, where absence, even brief or partial, tends to get filled in with narrative. Some corners of the internet framed Karolina's reduced output of traditional violin covers as evidence that something was wrong, that fame had taken a toll, or that she was stepping away entirely. The honest answer is far less dramatic and, frankly, more admirable. She was building a new chapter of her career rather than ending the old one. She has continued to perform, continued to post, and continued to engage with the community that supported her rise. She simply began doing so as an artist releasing original work rather than solely as a cover musician. It's worth noting how easily this kind of narrative gets constructed around young public figures, particularly those who grew up in front of an audience. A pause in one type of content, a change in branding, or simply the natural quieting that comes with adolescence and a heavier school and training schedule can be reframed online as crisis or decline, even when the reality is considerably more mundane. A teenager growing up, shifting priorities, and making an artistic choice about the direction of her own career.
Karolina Protsenko's story, from busking on 3rd Street Promenade at 9 years old to releasing original music as Karolina Rose at 17, offers a useful lens on what it actually looks like when a child performer matures into an adult artist without the collapse or scandal that so often gets attached to that transition in tabloid coverage of other young stars. She didn't disappear. She didn't have a falling out with her family, who remained closely involved in her career. She didn't step away from music. She simply did what any serious young musician eventually has to do if they want a career that outlasts their childhood internet fame. She found her own voice, in the most literal sense, and started using it. There's something worth sitting with in that. The easiest story to tell about a young performer's quiet period is one of crisis, because crisis is what generates clicks and views. But the more common, and often more meaningful, story is simply growth, the awkward, deliberate, sometimes commercially risky process of an artist, deciding they no longer want to be defined by the thing that made them famous as a child. Karolina Protsenko spent a decade becoming one of the most recognizable young violinists on the internet. Karolina Rose is what happens when that same person decides she's ready to be known for more than her instrument. So, what really happened to Karolina Protsenko? Nothing happened to her, in the sense that implies loss or misfortune. Something happened for her. She grew up, as performers who start young inevitably do, and she used that growth to take creative ownership of her own career. The girl who once stopped foot traffic on a California sidewalk with a violin case open at her feet is still making music. She's simply telling us, in her own words now, that she's ready to be heard as an artist in her own right, not just an interpreter of everyone else's songs. If there's a mystery here at all, it's the same mystery every young person eventually solves for themselves. Who am I when I'm not defined by what made me famous in the first place? Karolina Rose looks like an answer to that question, not a disappearance from it.